Good afternoon. Welcome to the event at the Constituency Office of MEPs Puigdemont, Comín and Ponsatí, Unity versus Democracy, the Case of Spain. I will now present our guests today, but if we were to set a starting date of all of this, the 11th of January 2017, President Puigdemont, being president of Catalonia, visited the Spanish government and had a meeting with Mariano Rajoy. In that meeting, Puigdemont was trying to agree a referendum or seek ways of an agreed exit to the Catalan issue about self-determination. Rajoy's answer was very simple. About the referendum, we will not even talk. We will not even talk about the referendum. It is something pre-political, as Mr. Simón would say. Afterwards, after the referendum of the 1st of October, in the 5th of September, Mr. Lesmes, the chief of the Spanish judiciary, as we saw in the video, declared something very important to understand this debate. He said that the constitutional foundation of the Spanish Constitution is the inseparable unity of the Spanish state. He didn't say that the rule of law or the Constitution was based in democracy or popular will or fundamental rights. He said that the Constitution was based in the indivisible unity of the Spanish nation. And this is what we want to talk about today, about this debate between the unity of the state and democracy and what implications it has. Because Mr. Puigdemont, Ms. Ponsatí and Mr. Comín are not here today in this office. They are in exile because all the Spanish judiciary considers that the unity of the state is more important than fundamental rights than democracy. And this is important, and it's important for Catalans. And it is also important for the Spanish state, but it's particularly important for Europe and for the future of the rule of law in Europe. Because is it the same to have a rule of law based on the unity of the state than one based in democracy and popular will? Are they the same thing? Can the European Commission treat them equally? This is the profound debate that we will deal with today. To do that, we have three guests of a very high level. First, we have here in Barcelona Professor Antoni Simón. He is doctor and professor in modern history at the Autonomous University in Barcelona. He has also written a book that you can see here, The Unity of Spain as a Political Value, which was published recently by publishing house Affairs, and he will explain to us the historical vision of this process of the unity of Spain. We'll also have an intervention of Joaquín Urías, professor of constitutional law at University of Sevilla, renowned constitutionalist and ancient judge of the Constitutional Court. He knows deeply the Spanish justice system. And finally, we'll have Neus Torbisco, professor of international law, senior research fellow at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and someone who is very active in the defense of the legitimate rights of the Catalan people, and she will give an international vision of this debate. I'll now give the floor to our first speaker, Antoni Simón, who has published the book The Unity of Spain as a Political Value, a book which is very important with lots of investigation, lots of references, in which every statement is justified widely and which analyzes from the Middle Ages to today how this concept has evolved. Mr. Simón, the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much. I'm very thankful to the constituency office of the MEPs, to the MEPs, and to Alessari for having invited me here to speak about a topic which I have been very interested in, particularly during the research process of this book. The event is about unity and democracy. I will mainly speak about what the refoundation of the Spanish Unitarianism meant from the Spanish Constitution of 1978, which, in my understanding, means to receive to juridify the main ideological legacy of Franquism, the idea of the national unity of Spain. I will focus on that, but first I would like to make some conceptual considerations, because this very same concept, unity of Spain, is a hybrid concept, which on the one hand contains a word which is a mainly philosophical concept, unity, and then on the other hand it has another word, Spain, which can be associated to the contemporary world, state, nation, but which is a concept which is basically political. In fact, unity and nation state and also democracy, we're talking about democracy versus unity, introduce the association of these two concepts, philosophical and political concepts. They introduce a profound problematic which has been present in all forms of political organization, from the empires of the ancient world to the liberal states of our current world. I'm referring to the issue of how to reconcile unity and diversity, a topic which, particularly in the liberal state of current days, introduces at its turn another one, which is the relationship between citizenship, identity, as well as flexibility that such identity needs to have in order to have cohesion that allows living together in community. If this is looked at in the long run, we can see that the political tradition of the Western world has definitely prioritized the value of unity over plurality. This is a fact that can be obtained from the philosophical formulations to the theological and religious bases that have shaped the different political and moral systems predominant in the social organizations of the Western world. If we look at Greek philosophy from Plato, we would assume the idea that the universe constitutes a rational everything derived from a single principle, and that there would be a unique moral principle, a sole moral principle informed of reason, according to these Greek philosophers and their followers, informed of a divine order, according to Christian theologists, or class struggle, according to Marxist theologies. In definitive, the unity has been a value, a predominant value, and it is true that the idea of pluralism is found in Greek philosophy and makes it to the 20th century with the well-known formulation, The Value of Pluralism by Isaiah Berlin, which basically states that there is a pluralism of moral values always, and Berlin at the same time warns about the dangers of the totalitarian temptation that comes with the quest of political unity. In any case, this same philosopher recognizes that the Unitarian perspective is the fundamental axis of Western political thought. Obviously, from this confirmation that the unity has been a predominant political value with respect to plurality, it is worth going deep into the why and how from the very beginning the unity has become a dominant value of the European cultural tradition. The first answer to this question, which I understand is fundamental, I found it in the studies of evolutionary psychology. Renowned studies of this discipline, like Alan Fisk, have stated that in humans there would be four moral intuitions, which are general in social relationships that we establish. The first one would be unity, second would be hierarchy, the third would be equality, and the fourth, proportionality. The value of unity would derive from the communal sharing of providing support to all members of the social group at the same time as preserving the integrity and the non-external pollution of a shared sentiment of collective responsibility towards a shared destiny. But these evolutionary psychologists, I was very shocked about the fact that these moral human intuitions, can be defined in very different ways and even contradictory according to the context in which they are found. The kind of value of the unity expressed in the religious and political systems is finally the product of a dialectical relation between these intuition and the cultural development and experiences of social relationships, on the other hand. In definitive, the starting point of the unity as a moral intuition could change according to political, religious, and moral contexts. But now, as I have said, and following the topic of this event, I will only focus on the historical phase that opens from the Spanish Constitution of 1978, which, as I have said, means a refoundation of the Spanish nationalist Unitarianism, a refounding characterized with transmigration into the democratic phase of the main ideological legacy of Franquism, the idea of the unity of the Spanish nation. To explain why this transmigration is produced, I will first refer to the general historical and ideological context of the moment of the Spanish Constitution of 1978 and the moment of this ideological transmigration and political transition. About this context, I would like to highlight three things. First, for the intellectuals of the late Francoist regime, which later composed the conservative right of the transition, for them it was non-negotiable to recognize a sole nation within the state. The argumentation could shift from the creationary role attributed to the nation and to the state, and also with respect to the cultural and political nature of the national construction of Spain. But the idea that the Spanish unity, this state unity, which was linked to Spanish political culture of the right and the far right, that was considered as the fundamental element to give continuity to the Francoist regime, as it had been the main argument of legitimizing such regime, and a regime which was based on this idea of the national unity of the Francoist regime. Despite the discourse of negating plurinationality of the state, that it was more defensive than ideologically and creative, it was pointing to the nuclear idea of or territorial organization of the state. These politicians and these ideologies were negating the quality of political subject and sovereignty that could be alternative to the Spanish nation. That around the 60s and 70s, the idea of national Unitarianism was settled as the main ideological axis of the Francoist dictatorship is not contradictory with the fact that the discourse of the right wing integrated in the regime was not very original or very elaborate. Actually, what it did basically was to take some Ortega and Gasset arguments and National Phalanges arguments to combine them with some of the conservative national thought. This ideological basis was maintained even after the death of the dictator and with the debates prior to the 1978 constitution on the topic of the nationalities to generate hatred in the conservative neo-Franquist right. The solution that Julián Marías, Pedro Lainez Trango, and Manuel Fraga Iribarne, Manuel Torras de Carranza, some people will remember them, these important politicians of the late Francoism, they gave to this contradiction between this Unitarianist ideology of Spain and between the obvious fact that there were vindications of other nations within the state, Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia. It was in considering that all of these were regionalisms, considering that they were regional issues, negating any national problematic within Spain. And secondly, with regards to this ideological historical context around 1978 and the Spanish Constitution, I would like to highlight that the Spanish anti-Francoist left were not very far away from the nationalist Unitarianism defended by the sectors close to the regime, and that the ideological conversion in this topic had very little obstacles. In fact, the right to self-determination would be interpreted as the constitution of the powers of the autonomies, assuming the integration of the different nationalities, the sub-state nationalities within the post-Francoist state. The Socialist Party and the Communist Spanish Party rejected that this right to self-determination could lead to separatist processes. Conversely, the idea of a single and indivisible Spain and the negation of the sub-state nationalities as political subjects is also very well reflected in the texts of Santiago Carrillo and Felipe González, Gregorio Pérez, and Jordi Soler Tura, and many other leftist politicians of the transition. These discursive elements show that the unity of the nation-state, the Spanish nation-state, and the understanding of the Spanish nation as a sole political subject were not exclusive property of the Spanish post-Francoist right-wing parties. In sub-state nationalisms, whether the separatist options were barely important at that moment in the late Franquism and the early transition, there were very vindications of the condition of Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia as political subjects. This was a very strong vindication and transversal vindication in Catalonia, in which the anti-Francoist left participated. But the political and ideological closeness of Catalan socialists and communists with the Spanish left parties during the second phase of the Spanish transition also brought to the closeness to the Spanish Unitarianism of these sectors of the Catalan left. The third element of context that I would like to highlight on that historical moment is that
we need to remember that this discourse about the organization of the state during the Spanish transition was taking into account the positioning of the armed forces in the national unity. In this sense, let me remind you that the Article 2nd of the Constitution that wanted to lock the unity of Spain during the drafting of it had some extra parliamentary ideas of the factic military powers, something that has been acknowledged by some of the creators of the authors of the Constitution. There are some jurists, Lucia Pallero, who says that it is important to revise this because it was not done back then, not even by the authors. And these three elements of the political and the ideological context during the Tardo-Frankism, the later Franco period, allow us to explain why there was this refoundation from this main ideological legacy of Frankism, the unity of Spain. This refoundation that is based on the Constitution back in 1978. So, on the one hand, the Constitution that was legitimized, taking into account the indivisibility of the unity of Spain, and then also this Constitution is a guardian of this unity of the Spanish nation. So this refoundation of this of the Spanish national unitarism, and I have tried to summarize the different ideological and legal ideas. So one of the principles of the Spanish national unitarism of the Constitution back in 1978 is in this Article 2, when it states that the Constitution is based on the stability of the unity of the Spanish nation. So this would be a pre-existent unity before the Constitution. So before and external, this constitutional moment. But in the Spanish Constitution, they say nothing about this unity. They don't say about when or how. And it's considered to be in the past. So we can understand that it has a factic sense and a historian sense and a historical sense as well. And this transcendental of this indivisibility above all contingencies, and making this reference to the past gives it a meta-political dimension and meta-juridical dimension. And in this meta-political dimension, let me remind you of this belief, this philosophical belief, and I will just quote Anna Gaden, a very famous philosopher, talking about this external idea outside the legal order, because of the totalitarianism that comes from this appropriation of this national will and the constituent power given to it. And this identification of this constituent power being meta-political cannot be linked with this fight back then, and then the use that is given to it. There are some times in which this has been used to legitimate some democratic revolutions. It's also been used to justify this domination and subordination.
In previous constitutional debates before the Constitution of the 78, the studies by a law professor, Jacquillo Bastida, has detailed how in these parliamentary debates, the proposal was defeated that the text had three legitimacy bases: the unity of Spain, to the solidarity among the people, and 3, the right to autonomy of the regions and nationalities of the state. Eventually, the idea of the post-Franco right wing imposed that the only foundation should be the unity of Spain. The second way why I talk about a refundation of Spanish national unitarism based on the text of the 78 is that this great principle must be defined the attribution of the Constitution by the Constitution of the Spanish people regarding national sovereignty. The Constitution says that national sovereignty resides in the Spanish people, from which the powers of state arise. Here, we can see an addition of 2 sovereignty concepts, national and popular, that are essentially contradictory. One edition that is explained based on the possibility that contradictions are subordinated to the objective to affirm the existence of one single nation, which is defined as the common, indivisible land of all Spanish people, and the only Spanish people is sovereign, ruling out the attribution of sovereignty to other nations or peoples that could exist within the Spanish state. The concept of a multiple sovereignty of a federal nature is completely ruled out in the constitutional text, as well as the idea of a constitutional pact among the peoples and nations that make up the state. From this unitarian sovereignty attributed to the Spanish nation, the text says that the right is recognized to the autonomy of the nationalities and regions that make it up. Some experts have interpreted this, among them Joaquín Varela has interpreted this as meaning that at the same time as the Constitution supports autonomic state, it automatically closes the possibility to create a federal state. The concept or federalizing system used by Spanish Socialist Party members when they ruled out a federal state could have a propaganda political nature, but not constitutional nature within the framework of the Constitution of 78. The third way that allows me to talk about this refundation of the national unitarism would be that in order to reinforce the Spanish national unitarism, the Constitution of 78 is supported on the idea of political and cultural nation. There may be a line of thought that wants to present the Spanish nation based on this text in terms, essentially, politicist terms, just granting the Spanish nation a subjective nature. It is hard to overlook the objectivistic culturalism of the Constitution. This cultural approach is manifested on the article number 2, where the Spanish nation is defined as a pre-existing body existing before the state and the legal the time of the legal constitution of it. This is based on the idea of a historical constitution already formulated by liberal parties in the 19th century, which sets forth one national being which is above any plurality of individuals or people, and which grants, as we've seen, legitimacy to the Constitution itself. The fourth way I see for this refounding is based on the fact that the foundations of the constitutional text was attributed to the indivisible nature of the Spanish nation, and that the Spanish people is defined as the only constituting power. This, together with many dispositive rules of the text addressed to the safeguard of the national unity, have allowed the existence of a theory, we've heard this on the video, that aspire to this unitaristic principle. The debate has many positions regarding self-determination. On the one hand, we have people that say that the right to self-determination of a part of the Spanish people does not exist within the framework of the Spanish Constitution of 78. But on top of that, it is not possible to introduce this right through an ordinary reform of the Constitution. They only foresee a total reform of the text approved by the constituting subject, that is the Spanish people. It could be possible to introduce the right to self-determination. This would be the position of very well-renowned jurists such as Javier Rupérez Alamillo or Jorge Zapata, who was a member of the Constitutional Court, which uphold the existence of material limits to the ordinary reform of the Constitution and deny the possibility to include the self-determination of a part of the Spanish people. This, unless, they say, there is a revolutionary process that overturns the Spanish integrity, or two, that through the unlimited power of the constituting sovereign powers, that is the whole population of Spain, a new constitution is drafted that allows this to exist. This theory has a radical version. Francisco González Navarro, who say that this indivisible unity of the Spanish nation constitutes the fundamental norm or rule of the Constitution and all the regulations of Spain. And not even the Spanish people is able to modify this. According to González Navarro, the autonomous regime is not a fundamental of the Constitution, but a fruit of it can be suppressed with constitutional reform. We must say, however, that these theories are opposed by the thesis of lawyers that want to get these legal provisions to reality, and that said the fundamental rule of the text on the superior values that are defined not on the second article, but the first one, which are freedom, justice, equality, and political pluralism. For example, Juan Ramón Fallada García Valle says that without freedom, we cannot have real unity. So interpreting that this unity itself is a purpose, an absolute purpose. This professor of philosophy makes a difference between with legitimacy. And Mr. González Navarro also states, the former president of the Supreme Council, highlights that if the unity of Spain was the fundamental rule that legitimizes the political power, also the dictatorships of Franco and Primo de Rivera would have been legitimate regimes. So this thesis has the risk that it interprets as violent any activity, even though if it's pacifist, that questions the unity of Spain, even a reform of the second article in spite of the way provided by article number 168 of the text. And the fifth way, I see, let me say that the reform of the text of the Spanish national unitarism based on the Constitution of 78 has gone together with state nationalism discourse with several expressions that go beyond the right and left wing dichotomy that constitute this juridic base of legitimacy of the Constitution. I don't have enough time to define all this, but I want to highlight that in order to legitimize the unitarian Spanish state, identifying this with positive values related to freedom and equality, while sub-state nationalisms are identified as ethnico-cultural nations that cannot achieve these democratic values. These are political declarations that we've seen on the news many times, on many occasions. This argument by Francesc de Carrera Serra or Gregorio Peces Barba has allowed to reverse the role attributed to nationalisms during the dictatorship, because with the equations nation state Spain equal to civic nation equals democracy, it strengthens the Spanish state unity, consecrating the second article of the Constitution, and this delegitimizes subnational nationalisms, sub-state nationalisms. Let me just say to end my speak that this artificial dichotomical construct has been criticized because it can be used as a non-democratic weapon to use to demonize all any positions that go against the unity and the right to self-determination, but also to overlook that the difference between nationalisms is that differentiates nationalisms that construct a nation based on free consent from those that base it on various forms of coercion. That's all.
Bé, moltes gràcies, professor Simón, per aquesta explicació dels orígens ideològics.
Thank you, Mr. Simón, for your explanations. I'm sure that during the Q&A sessions, we can talk further about this. Now we'll have Joaquín Urias, professor of law at the University of Seville. He has not been able to be present because he's on a trip right now, but he has sent a video that will allow us to understand the constitutional situation in the Spanish state after these 5 years of repression to defend the unity above of democracy. Let's see this video. The Spanish Constitution of 1978 tried to create a framework where coexistence of all is possible, an open framework with many possibilities. In territorial terms, the Constitution does not set a defined model. It leaves it open to later developments. During the first years of the Constitution, when the autonomous communities were created, a federal system was seen as something possible, which the Spanish Constitution does not forbid. In fact, it includes the various state bases of any federal state, such as Germany or Austria. After these first years, when it seemed that the central government would allow the development of a federal system where the various territories would have a decent level of self-governance, we've seen several waves of recentralization that have made this dream unrealizable. A dream of a federal Spain where the territories have a level of self-governance that's wide and broad. This has been reduced through case law that's very centralized. And the society, we've seen an increase of the popularity of the idea that Spain needs to be decided in Madrid, and this has made the development of a federal Spain to be developed that was promised by the Constitution of the 78. There's no political will to realize the possibilities of these constitutions or to reform it in terms of decentralization. With this context, for the first time in history, we've put on the balance, on the one hand, the unity of Spain, which we don't know what it is exactly, and on the other side, the fundamental rights. The unity of Spain in constitutional terms is basically the idea that the Constitution applies to the whole territory. There's no concept such as Spanish unity. Spain wouldn't break if the Chafarinas Islands are given to Morocco, if Gibraltar becomes Spanish territory again, or the town of Olivenses return to Portugal. The unity is the territory. Nowhere it says that the territory of 1978. The idea of unity is the idea that the principles and the constitutional values apply to everyone and over all the territory and everywhere. What happens that from the central state, there have been bodies that have made an interpretation of this unity in terms of territorial terms. They have identified unity with indivisibility, and they have put this ahead of all fundamental rights. The important thing of the Constitution is that it offers a democratic horizon, and for the first time is based on the fundamental rights. During the Franco period, there was unity. Franco laws maintain this unity, but the unity of Spain, the framework where the lives of citizens happens, is not more important than fundamental rights. Our constitution is democratic in so much as it allows for the self-determination of individuals, and these are rights. The fact that a way of being or thinking cannot be imposed from outside, that freedom of speech, demonstration, and education is granted. These values make a constitution a democratic one. At present, we've seen a step back because there are forces that would rather have a united Spain than a democratic one. This means the destruction of the Constitution. Those that consider themselves constitutionalists are those who are destroying the constitutional principles. The value of the Spanish Constitution is democracy, the rights, and this is what sets it apart from other systems. So no development of the Constitution is possible unless it is based on the respect of fundamental rights. When the Spanish Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, or other forces put unity ahead of the respect of individual rights, they are simply destroying the Constitution and ignoring the constitutional effort made in 1978. A Catalan politician using his rights to fight for independence is more constitutional than a Spanish politician that defends unity by repressing the rights of others.
Professor Urias
has been clear about the current situation of the regression of rights and the implications for Spain and Europe. And talking about Europe and the international arena, we have from Geneva, Neus Torbisco, She is a PhD in international law. She's an expert in minority rights and in transitional justice in various states. Thank you, Inés, for being with us. You have the floor. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It is a pleasure for me. I don't know if you can hear me properly because I'm not hearing you very well. My intervention is going to be around assessing this dilemma of unity versus democracy as a conflict between two values that are considered to be opposed. I think the intervention by Mr. Urias and the author of the book, Mr. Simón, express very well this idea that we see in the title of this event, Democracy versus Unity, which evokes the concession of this debate in Spain, as we've seen with the previous speeches, both by constitutionalist lawyers or jurists, and also by historians. What I would like to highlight is to disassemble this opposition. This is a false dilemma because we assume that these two values are intrinsical to our, but in fact, unity is considered an absolute value that cannot be limited by the democratic actions such as self-determination recognized in the Article 1 that says that all peoples have a right to self-determination and therefore they can define their legal political status. It is clear from the previous speeches that this framework sets a dilemma. We cannot have unity and democracy at the same time. From my point of view, this dilemma is a false dilemma, and this is what I will try to justify. This conflict arises if we consider national unity as something valuable, and if we have a specific national democracy. And this dilemma disappears from a liberal perspective based on the protection of human rights, and where unity and democracy have no intrinsic value. The only value of state itself is an instrumental one for the protection of what we consider basic goods or values or rights, human rights, probably whatever, which is the basis of the liberal revolution models that sets the framework for the constitutional architectures in the modern times. Therefore, what we often call constitutionalist defense in Spain is a state-nation unitary model that is used to justify systematic domination of national majorities above minorities. These minorities are nations that have been considered as minorities due to historic reasons, because they didn't have the power to achieve their own stateless nations, as we normally call them. These are minorities in demographic terms. But democracy is everything but unity. Democracy is difference and conflict, plurality. Democracy, in order to work, must be a mechanism to solve conflicts. So democracy itself doesn't have a value in itself, but it is a tool to manage something that is intrinsic to this political system, not a number of instrumental rules, elections for one party or another to win. Democracy goes beyond that, and the idea of the dominion by the majority. Populist movements do that. They reduce democracy to the preservation of the will of the electoral majority instead of democracy as a system to articulate different identities or feelings of belonging to the polis. Therefore, democracy tries to accommodate different ideologies and different narratives and approaches of this polis, understood not in the classical terms, but in the sense of an open political community. The case of Spain is not unique. At an international level, the Spanish case is part of an argumental construct that comes from liberalisms that legitimize the creation of states based on classic nationalistic ideals. Nationalism explains from liberal illustration values in the case of human freedom are the framework of a state based on a pre-political unity, as we said before, that this is considered a pre-constitutional, pre-political social idea protected by the Constitution. This is typical from the constitutional concept linked to an idea of unitarian nationalism, on which the foundational pillars of liberal nationalism is based. Empires such as the Austro-Hungarian disappeared due to conflicts caused by minorities in what was considered an empire. This is our perspective from the 21st century. But the construction of a national state is based on an original sin. Nationalism is the ideology that covers the legitimacy of the construction of a modern state. But this nationalism, as explained by Ernest Kellner, was not an inclusive one. It was a nationalism that was exclusive, essentialist one, based on the idea that every nation is based on one single culture, language, past, and a fiction that we are one and that we belong to the same nation. The term nation in Latin, natio, means to be born, the place where you're born. So this is what unites us, the place of birth. However, if we investigate about nationalism and democracy, today, almost all theoreticians understand that this idea of nation is an imaginative one. There is no nation that's not based on certain contradictions, different cultures, a mix of ethnic groups, etc. Therefore, the Catalan nation is the result of history, cultural, and other elements that have implied a normative political community. So this national construction leads us to a will by the present subjects that are part of these nations to have a political project. In this respect, this is not different than what happened in the United States or France. What's the problem of the national creation? Since its creation and constant building, unless we are existentialists and we think that's an essence to a nation, which I don't think it's a valid theory, every nation, the creation of every nation implied the destruction of other nations. There's a very interesting publication, which is not very well known, by a political theorist, Walter Connor, that in 1972, in a very important journal called World Politics, published an article called Nation Building or Nation Destroying. And Walter Connor emphasized the fact that national construction theories that overlap with democratic construction theories have overlooked the question of internal diversity, the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious diversity, because these theories have considered that this was a small hindrance to the national integration.
So how did this obstacle was overcome? Well, as Connor said, with the destruction of the nations, the solution, we must remember the traditional solution during the 19th century in the building of a state as the American or the French one, in taking into account the internal diversity, has been the suppression on the one hand, or this forced assimilation, or these policies of tolerance. It is the melting pot idea of the United States. So the case of France during the French Revolution, so people talked about Paris, and that's it. But the first law that was approved after the approval of after this Republic, it says that on Monday morning, all the children at the school are going to start French lesson. So the French educational law was so coercive that in a few decades it suppressed internal plurality. And everybody knows that the religious minorities in Europe migrated to the States because in the States, this white territory favored these politics of tolerance, of living and letting people live. And this is why the polygamy is accepted. Amish children don't need to go to school, and as other children, because they consider that there are some groups and internal diversity, and it is reasonable to keep this diversity. But this idea of assimilation, in some cases has caused some problems. For example, the indigenous peoples. In Canada, for example, everybody knows about the residential schools in which indigenous children were kind of kidnapped by the state to put them in these schools that were boarding schools. And the goal of these schools was to take the Indians out of the child. So to remove the indigenous person out of the soul of the child. It is a project of internal colonization based on the idea that the state can be built on this unity of nation, because there will be some risks of this integration. And it is something that we have inherited from the empires, the risk of the empires to disagree, and also this constitutional idea that diversity has to have limits. And it is not only in Spain, because in the United States, also Puerto Rico as a protectorate. It is explained also because Puerto Rico, they speak Spanish. So one of the longest sessions in the Congress in the United States in the 90s. They discussed the situation of Puerto Rico and the fact that Puerto Rico could become the 52nd state of the Union. And these discussions landed more than 2 hours, finished with an agreement between Democrats and Republicans, like between in Spain during the left and the right parties. And it said that Puerto Rico could belong to the unit if they renounced Spanish as an official language. And going further back, when Napoleon sold Louisiana to Jefferson in this treaty in which Louisiana started being in the United States, Napoleon said, my only condition is that in the territory of Louisiana, French can still be spoken, and that the civil French law can be taught in the law schools. This is why in the States, if you want to learn French civil law, you can go to Louisiana, the University of Louisiana. And Jefferson is in many books, history books, and he explains that when he finished this treaty, he said, Louisiana will not belong to the Union unless we alter the population of this state. And then they started a policy that facilitated the acquisition of land to Anglo-Saxons. And when they were sure that in Louisiana most of the population spoke English, then Louisiana started being one of the states of the Union. And the only democracy in which the Constitution does not include an official language, and it was not clear if German or English were the dominant languages, and then they decided not to include an official language. And there has been an assimilationist project based on this national unity, that everybody belongs. And so the rights of the citizens are rights that have a unidirectional relation with the state and not through intermediate groups. This is why the federalism is very minoritarian. In Germany, there is federalism, but it is a territorial one, and it doesn't have a federal model to recognize these internal cultures. So what's the impact of all this in the self-determination right? And if you understand that there is this dominant idea, which the assimilationists and the tolerance is one of the projects that can facilitate the creation of a state that are plurinational and also integrated in the conception of the majority. Then what happens in human rights is, in that model, most of the rights recognized are individual rights. This idea of non-discrimination, for example, is understood taking into account the social minorities, not being discriminated as an individual, also equity, not being discriminated, not the equality between national groups, but between people. And this is what hindrances the recognition of collective rights as a different rights from the human rights. And this model has made the reduction of social injustice problems to different ideologies between left and right ideologies. The differences in distribution, but not of recognition. And what some Canadian actors and jurists call the politics of recognition is based on the idea that belonging to the state can be mediatized by other national groups that are more important for the individual. The language belonging, more important than the political belonging, the state. And the unity, taking this perspective into account, is not a value in itself. The unity is just a value if achieving it goes through the sacrifice of other values, as, for example, the right to the cultural belonging, the right to the language, right to the self-determination, not as an individual, as your individual freedom, but a collective group. So these type of rights have been marginalized, and the international tools of rights, because it's the democratic states that have created these tools, and they give a value to this idea of individual rights and not collective rights. So if we understand this link of the creation of constitutional states and the idea that this creation has to exclude or assimilate the internal diversity in order to become a mono-national state, and these are the states that mainly have been protagonists of the normative creation at international level, we understand this reluctancy to make these rights of self-determination something true and far beyond decolonization. And why do I say that? And because during the decolonization, the self-determination right was considered, and most of the liberal states understood that the colonization was a very injustice and oppressive project. They understood that in reality, colonialism, the conquer of our territory, made some injustices, and these injustices were recognized. And in order to repair these injustices in these colonized territories, it was assumed that they had the right to self-determination as a result of this oppression model. And what happened to the nations trapped in this project of national construction based on power? In a specific context, we cannot say that the definition of the borders in Europe or the world was based on ideals of justice. So this idea of a transition towards democracy was done assuming this oppression of some groups over the others. And some states made this exercise of transition towards democracy that implied the recognition of these injustices. This recognition that the constitution cannot be based on the forced inclusion and this forced marriage of groups that have not, who didn't want to create this political group. It is easier to do this in the colonies because it was assumed in the 60s that there was not another way to move forward in this model of liberal democracy ideology. And the internal colonialism, indigenous peoples and the national minorities is not as recognized because in the states, most of the injustices are related to these injustices in the distribution. So right and left parties talk about the redistribution of social assets, not cultural or language. Marxism, for example, and liberalism have always argued about how to redistribute the propriety and not the esteem or the honor or the historical dignity, and values that are not material values, but are very important in the life of people. The feeling of feeling inferior or superior, and this happens in national minorities and race, gender, language. These are different phenomena of systemic oppression. And in my opinion, the construction of democracy, in order to be a real democracy, should be based on the recognition of this marginality of this systemic oppression. And this is what the Spanish constitutional system hasn't done, recognizing this internal oppression and also the external oppression. Like, for example, Mr. Josep Borrell, vis-a-vis the Spanish conquer. So Spain has never said, I'm sorry for the conquer, for the colonization. And this means that there is this instrumental defense, and it's a value in itself. So these values is incompatible in this regime. And it is a regime of emancipation. And in this sense, let me stop here because we will not have time to open a Q&A session. So in this sense, we understand why there is this reluctancy in these collective rights, like self-determination, because these ideals of domination can only be understood vis-a-vis this distributive injustice, but not one derived from this lack of recognition, lack of structural equalities. And if democracy and the risks that we have in democracy based on populism are risks of oppression of minorities. This democratic populism puts this at risk, the rights of minorities. And this idea that democracy is going backwards, and it is going to continue like this if we don't face this idea of historic oppression. And the case of Catalonia is an important case, because the way this is solved, we are going to see the evolution of other minority nations all over the world. Thank you very much.
Moltes gràcies, Neus, per la teva intervenció tan interessant.
Thank you very much, Neus, for your intervention about colonization, democracy, justice, redistribution of rights, and which are the rights that are redistributed and the ones that are denied. Thank you very much for your intervention. So you said that democracy is the sentiment, and this means that it is also discussion and dissension. We are going to open a Q&A session. You can write it down. And we are going to start by MP Ponsatí. I will just ask a question because I'm sure there will be a lot of people interested in intervening. So thank you very much to everybody. It's been extraordinary. And also this brief intervention of Professor Urias. And I am more constitutionalist than the members of the Constitutional Court. So I just wanted to ask something to Dr. Torbisco about what she said about the decolonization process and the self-determination right in the context of decolonizations. I am very aseptic And he talked that in this case, democracies recognized that there was a need to overcome these injustices and this oppression. And allow me to disagree. This happened during the Cold War and the independence of Algeria and some decolonization processes in which the states had to face these rebellions. And in the end, the decolonization of Africa was also complicated. So we can talk about rights and justice and democracy, but while things are going on, it's not that clear. Well, it just gives me some space to reflect upon present. Our problem is not that our rights are not fundamented, legal fundament, because all politicians could understand that our fight is a democratic fight and pacific fight, but in the end, when the Catalans always being the pioneers, maybe we were the first colony of Spain, and maybe we will be the last one. But in any case, I just wanted to say this, that if there was a decolonization because of the international context that promoted it, and also because of the fight, armed fight in many places of the planet. Thank you very much, Clara. Well, it is very interesting, this question, because it allows me to give more details about what I said and that I explained very briefly and in a very simplistic way. So one thing would be the factic factors, the factic fact that boosted the first steps of decolonization. But if we see what happened in between wars, before the Second World War, in which there was a lot of talk about self-determination during the Wilson context and the construction of the Society of Nations. Wilson had this idea of these 10 criteria for self-determination, and he thought that they should do some specific treaties for minorities. So this was based on the idea that the diversity should be taken seriously and to guarantee this autonomy system and sovereignty, what Michael Keating would say, shared sovereignty. We have to do treaties with the minorities so that they have enough sovereignty so that they don't rebel, and is a way to create peace. Wilson was a pacifist, and he thought that minorities was very important for security. And now the problem is the same. Minorities are treated as something related to security and not rights. And I understand your realism. So there was a moral transformation, and then it was implemented the same as with the women. Women first took the streets, and then there was someone who said women rights are human rights. So we all know that. But this vision of Wilson based on these human rights and this pragmatic idea of saying, well, there is also a risk of rebellion. Even if there is a risk of rebellion, then the security is at risk. And if there are some elements that are important in these groups in order to keep the diversity, because Wilson was a very open-minded, so we need to have these minority treaties, and this failed. And for many people who created the United Nations after the Second World War, they thought that it failed because it incorporated these group rights. And it means that these groups got empowered, and then it brought to the Second World War, for example, in Germany, this ethnic group that was superior to the Jews. So the experience of Nazism was very bad for the collective rights of minorities, because after the Second World War, there was this idea that people have rights because we are people, not because we belong to specific groups. This idea that the human rights are individual, universal, homogeneous, and the state has to protect these individual rights, not the collective rights. And as Walker Connor says, the problem of minorities is not solved. So Wilson tried to solve it by the idea of Nazism, and this superiority created this panic, and then they thought that these collective rights could not be recognized, and this self-determination is a principle, is not a right. And a lot of these liberal people considered that they couldn't keep this colonization. There was a lot of criticism in the United Nations that it was very oppressive and incompatible with human rights. So this favored this. The dominant ideology about morality of colonialism favored that the self-determination could not be understood as a universal right, but a solution to justify that Europe was in favor of this decolonization process. So what's the problem? That the justification links the self-determination, and when it is an external self-determination, because it can be internal also, like for example, Quebec in Canada. But this external self-determination to have a state is considered as just the last resort, because everybody considers that the destabilization of the integrity of the borders is something that causes destabilization. This happens also during the 50s. In the 20th century in the European Union, it has no sense because there is not a unique and rooted sovereignty. So we Catalans, and in Catalonia, in Quebec, in Scotland, we are trying this process of emancipation in this system in order to create something very concrete, the imperialism process. And nobody would say that imperialism is legitimate and valid. So a Belgian person will not say this. The Belgian king went to Congo to say, I'm sorry for the injustices caused by the colonization, but the internal diversity is considered as something that is domestic. And this is the wall that we need to make fall, so to say. And this is the wall we need to break. And our idea as Catalans is that we are in this framework that is thought only for decolonization processes. So which is the solution from my perspective? And this is what I try to do during my research, that self-determination is justified as an answer to oppression. And this is why a lot of people has assumed that the Kosovo is a state, because previously there was a systemic oppression, an attempt of genocide, but this generates a paradox, Wilson paradox. If we do not recognize and empower, we are going to generate a conflict, and we are trapped in this paradox. So only if there are dead people or a genocide or extreme violence, then the recognition of the self-determination is accepted. And I think that the challenge is that the last expression of democracy is the right of self-determination. And a limit of human rights is if human rights cannot be compatible of this democratic emancipation, like in Catalonia or Quebec or Scotland, then we are keeping this marginalization of some groups. And this marginalization, as we women do, is a way of oppression. Is the fact that you don't have the same rights as others to make your rule of law, it is not neutral, is a way of oppression. And this argument has a gender equality back in the 50s. It is not truly assumed. And as it is not truly assumed, it is still there. We are still restricted by the self-determination framework that is very limited. And I think that the only solution would be to stress on this framework, which is not neutral, and it favors the status quo and the domination of states as a privileged voice in the construction of the global normativity.
Escolta, faig una pregunta perquè corresponguin i passem al Toni. Digues, Albert. Crec que...
Go ahead, Albert. I think we have a microphone. First of all, congratulations for this event. And I would like to focus on the words by Neos. I'm interested in this topic, and we talked about the self-determination of people and how this self-determination that was thought for colonies in the 70s and 60s has been applied in these cases we have mentioned. And in our case, in the case of Catalonia, this cannot be applied. It seems it cannot be applied because there's not been the same conditions of a colony. So what do Catalans need to do to have our own decolonization process, our independence process? What things we need to do, because of course this is a theory, there are no previous experiences. What do politicians need to do to make pressure and to lobby, and because this process cannot be perpetuated in time? And what are your recommendations? Let me add my own question. Since you've been talking about the constitution is based on the unity of the nation, I would like to ask two things for Professor Simón. What are the practical implications that the constitution is based on the unity of the nation? And for Professor Tobisco, is this the case in Canada? Professor Tobisco knows the Canadian case. The unity of Canada is more important than the fundamental rights of the people from Quebec.
Bueno, espera, a veure, qui respon dels dos primers?
No sé qui voleu que contesti primer.
I don't know who you want to answer first, because I cannot see you, so. I'll try to answer the question regarding the comments by Professor Tobisco and Professor Urias. As an historian, I would like to add a few remarks. First, regarding the fact that these self-determination independence processes have been somehow linked, those which are not decolonization processes, to add conflictivity, a strong conflictive I don't think that's true. There are cases that are very buried. Just if we look back to the 20th century, we have the cases of Iceland, Montenegro, Czech Republic, Latvia, Estonia. So we have historical cases where there has not been any conflict. The distribution of states at the beginning of the 20th century was one, and at the beginning of the 21st century was different, and we've seen different routes to achieve these changes. Regarding this sort of opposition between individual rights and collective rights, basically based on the theories of Hegner, with the liberal state that generates a number of rights, I don't agree for a simple reason. We're talking about, as Niels Nabisco said, of individual rights and equity. France, which has been mentioned, when were women allowed to vote? Well, it was from 1944, not before. So these are not absolute truths. It is not absolute as well that the French model can be considered the general model. The Helvetian Confederation is a very different model, or the case of the Scandinavian countries. Regarding your question, this idea of Spanish national unity expressed in the Constitution of '78, we need to highlight that it is a legacy of the Franco period, and the work by Jacobeo Bastida exemplifies this clearly, and from an ideological point of view is fundamented on the 21st century with Ortega Gasset, which is not a very democratic foundation. Regarding the Constitution, the unity of Spain is, on the one hand, the basis for the Constitution, and at the same time, the Constitution is the watchdog due to several provisions of this unity. And the Spanish Constitution doesn't include the word federal, not one time in the whole text. So when we want to develop the autonomous community system, this closed any federal approach, because a federal system is not having autonomous competencies. It's the recognition of being.
Sí. Neus?
Bé, torno sobre el tema de l'autodeterminació.
Going back to the topic of self-determination, when I talk about collective individual rights, self-determination, I'm talking about the point of view of the international law and of human rights. It's not a sociological approach. I mean the construction, the juridic construction of the international system of human rights. In these terms, we can talk about self-determination before the 20th century. The concept of self-determination dates back to the French and American Revolution in the sociological sense. But as right in the international arena, the principle of self-determination arises and starts to be developed as such within the United Nations as a basic interpretation in relation to this decolonization process. During the First World War, the principle of self-determination was specially understood both by Lenin and Wilson. So very different regimes and systems, such as the one in the United States and the Soviet Union. So Lenin and Wilson agreed on specifying these 14 points established by Wilson in 1918. So she said that national aspirations need to be respected. People may not be dominated, and when they are, it must be with their consent. This is the preamble of these 14 points by Wilson. Lenin agreed with these 14 points, the idea that people cannot be dominated by a political structure, which is the state. The state is an instrument for people to be constituted in their sovereignty. This declined when, after the Second World War, in the scope of the human rights of the United Nations, when we have more than 10,000 pages of documents around the creation of human rights, that they don't include the right to self-determination. Only in the conventions of 1965, not the ones after the Second World War. Why? Well, there are thousands of pages on the creation of the Declaration of the Human Rights that prove that there was a focus on no right was recognized as a collective right, so that universal rights and human rights are individual rights that the state recognizes, and that these rights are the rights protected by the constitutions. This protection of the minorities declines due to this, because there was a fear to the ethnicization of nations. After Nazism, an idea arose, and you can see that in the judges of the Nuremberg trials. They don't recognize the people because of this idea that the people is a myth that doesn't recognize diversity. And this is one of the roots or reasons why it is very complicated within the system of the United Nations to think about these groups, because there's this idea that rights are individuals. We just talk about rights in a metaphorical way, and they can always be reduced to individual rights. In this sense, the right to self-determination arises not with the creation of the United Nations, but 15 years later, to give a response to a number of social movements of emancipations. So there was first an attempt to emancipation, and this was transformed into a regulatory principle. So answering the first question from the point of view of politology, what can we do? Well, this happens with all sorts of rights, because the ruling in the United States that declares unconstitutional racial segregation, and with the same constitution, the United States has been allowed, and now it's forbidden abortion, and racial segregation with the brown versus the Board of Education ruling abolished because it was contrary to the Constitution, the same Constitution allowed, and it doesn't allow now, racial segregation. So this Constitution can be interpreted according to the times. So this constitutional framework could pave the way for a referendum in Catalonia. Likewise, the case of Quebec, in Canada. It's exactly the same. The Canadian Constitution incorporates, as the Spanish Constitution does, all the international rights of human rights within the Constitution. The Charlottetown Agreements in 1982, when the Constitution was repatriated, this is the word they use for the constitutional transformation. This was done in order to reintegrate Quebec as a constituting nation, a sovereign nation within Canada. This was done using the same constitutional rules we have in Spain to find a balance between unity and diversity. During this process, this transformation process, we have declarations by one of the MPs talking about the policy of recognition that says being Canadian is not being part of a culture or a nation. Being Canadian is accepting that we all have hyphenated identities. We all have different identities. Being Canadian means accepting that we are not part of a unitarian nation, but democratic project, and that we all have hyphenated identities, meaning that we all belong to different groups and that we are free to express ourselves as such. So the transformation of the Canadian flag that before remind us of the Union Jack, and it incorporated the maple leaf, as we all know.
Es va incorporar un element de la natura i no un element
So this natural element was incorporated instead of political element because it was an integrating element of the nations that make up Canada. This is the asymmetric federal model that makes Canada transform the Supreme Court rules, and now a judge from Quebec has the right to veto any interference by the federal powers in the competencies of Quebec. Quebec doesn't need to go to the Supreme Court, but any law that is considered to interfere with the competencies can be vetoed. This is a federal model that's not that doesn't follow the German style, but an asymmetric one. Asymmetry is necessary in order to recognize differences, because if you don't recognize differences, you cannot be equal. And here, equity is the equity between individuals, between equal people. So the independency movement has lost power today because people want to have independence, to have a voice, and to have the power to continue to exist. If you think that you can continue to exist as a people recognizing the Canadian Constitution as a distinct nation, then maybe it doesn't make sense to be a state anymore. So state, unity, and democracy are values in themselves. The three are values in so much they protect the rights of people. And in this sense, it is fundamental to understand that collective rights are as important as individual rights. And this, from the liberal point of view, is not understood. This is a specific debate with new alliances between Esquerra Republicana, PSC, and the Comuns. The focus is always in the restitution and social rights, not the recognition of Catalonia as a nation. And you may say, why is that important? Well, because symbology is important. We are who we are because people recognize us as such. So recognition, as Charles Taylor says, is a biologic process. I cannot recognize myself. Other people need to recognize myself as a woman, as a Catalan, whatever. So the challenge here would be to understand that this is a legitimacy issue, not a legality issue. We are legitimated to use self-determination because we are people. We are not better or worse, but we have the same rights as other people. But people say, all right, if you do this, we will have other states arising. And the answer to this question, which I heard in 1998 in Bristol, made to a very well-recognized professor in there, if we recognize the right to self-determination, in 20 years, we will have many more states. And her answer was, so what? That was her answer. What's the value of states if they don't represent the voice of people and have a presence in the international arena by the various groups, cultural, political, linguistic groups that they contain? If you think that state has value in itself, you can negate the right to self-determination. And this is not clear in Europe beyond the framework of oppression. Thank you, Professor. It's the same that what women have done to continue to fight for this to be understood.
Moltes gràcies, professora Torbisco. Moltes gràcies, professor Simón.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Torbisco and Professor Simón. Now I give the floor to Minister Comín to close the event. Let me tell you that there was a boy who made a fascism greeting in front of our office. And I think that this links to this idea of wrongly understood. We cannot receive the sound. We're terribly sorry. Yes. Good evening. Do you hear me? Yes, we hear you. Well, I just wanted to give a few words because we are behind the schedule and I'm going to be brief. I just wanted to start. I just wanted to thank from the bottom of my heart the speakers who have participated. Thank you, Antoni Simón, Neus, and also Professor Urias. And it's been a very interesting session, and it's very important to talk about all these, and we would need more time to talk about all these, and also the recognition of the political philosophy in the history of law and history of Professor Simón and Torbisco and constitutional law. So we could just talk and talk about this. So it's been very fruitful. Just to close, to give you a couple of ideas that complement what has been said. And we wanted to organize this today because it's the day of the Spanish Constitution. And I think that from the different perspectives, this idea that we can explain in a simple way is that the Spanish Constitution of the 1978 was a daughter, so to say, of an agreement of political forces, democratical forces, and Franquism forces. And out of the European states, the only one that has not built its democracy over the totalitarianism is Spain. In Western Europe and the European Union, in Eastern countries, they build their democracies on the defeat of the totalitarianism, and all fascism regimes were suppressed but the Spanish one. And this Franquism soul that considers that unity is a value in itself, and that unity is over the fundamental rights. So it is coherent with the Constitution to suppress and to limit and vulnerate these fundamental rights as civical and political rights. So this would be the Franco soul of the Spanish Constitution. And then we have also the democratic soul, although Neus is right when she says that democracy is an instrumental tool. So the democratic soul of the Constitution that considers that everything is at the service of the rights because they have a value, and in these fundamental rights, civil rights, political rights, and all the fundamental rights. So not in the name of the integrity of the unity, we can repress some of these rights, and which is the problem? These two souls, well, it's not that they are not compatible, and it is impossible to move forward with a constitutional development that wants to look at balance. Let's find a balance between these two souls. This is a fiction. And when political conflicts are manifested is when we see that these two souls are incompatible. We cannot reach a balance. So one will sacrifice the other. And in the case of Spain, what happened with the Catalan conflict is an expression of how this Franquism soul has been over the other one. And we can give you an example. The ruling of the Supreme Court and many other rulings against the independentist leaders. Well, some jurisdictions have analyzed the same facts in Germany, and they explained that what we did is a fundamental right. The Belgian court also, and there is no an international order because Switzerland would consider it to be a prosecution, and the extradition also. So I am giving you this example as an example of these two souls cannot coexist. So either one or the other. The 1st of October is an expression of sedition, an attempt against the unity of Spain. Or the 1st of October is just fundamental rights. And our drama is that for the historical reasons that we all know, a constitution with two souls that cannot really coexist in a balance as deployed in this constitution in which the Franco soul is imposed fully. And I will not give you historical considerations, but we know that Franco's regime had this fixation with the unity of Spain, because it is the expression of this nationalism of this defeated empire. So it needs this defense of the territorial integrity of this defeated empire. And just to explain, as Clara said, the answer of Neus, and how the historical processes go first, and then the philosophical theories come later, and the feminist movement wins, and then we do the theorization, and in many other movements. So what is happening in Spain? If the democratic perspective is imposed, and this is like a summary or a conclusion of what we heard today. So if the civil rights were fully respected, then we would find the way to use the right of self-determination. This is why they need repression, because the right of self-determination is inherent in democracy. It's collective rights, and collective rights are as important as individual rights. And if we are fully respected our political rights, we are going to execute them and use the right of self-determination, and we will conquer it. And for this reason, they cannot tolerate the defenders of the unity of Spain a full recognition of the civil and political rights, because then the unity of Spain would be threatened. And this would be the concept of Spain facing this trilemma. So it cannot be a state with just one nation and democracy, and with democracy, and maybe a nationalist left party could think of, but we know that it is impossible. If Spain had wanted to be just one state and a democratic state, the price would have been recognizing the plurinationality, like Canada, as Neus explained. Maybe then it would have been possible to keep just one democratic state with a political and civil rights guaranteed, and thanks to, or at the price of, the recognition of the plurinationality. This would be the Canadian solution. If Spain wants to be just one state with just one nation, then the repression has to be used, because Catalan people don't want to accept this imposition of an identity and a language and a culture that is not ours. So this idea of just one state with one culture can be done with the acceptance, with the sacrification of the political rights, and without democracy. So it is not possible to have a single national democratic state. If Spain wants to be a democratic state, then if Spain wants to be a state, a democracy, a mono-national democracy, then they have to do it sacrificing the territorial unity. And it is possible to have a democratic nation, but only if it renounces to Catalonia. If it allows the independence of Catalonia, then the rest of Spain will be just one nation and democratic without Catalonia. So this would be the trilemma. It is impossible to achieve these three things. And Catalan people, we've made this trilemma evident, and we have put it in the mirror of the European justice and the European courts and of the United Nations with its resolutions that manifest this trilemma that cannot be achieved. So Today was the day to do this reflection, and then we can keep on listening to these wise words. And I wanted to thank all of you. It is our discussion that concerns us, and we are going to continue talking with all these experts. So thank you very much to you all, and good evening.